Imagine a world where George Washington was executed as a traitor, his head perhaps displayed on a pike as a grim warning. Picture North America, not as a beacon of freedom, but as a patchwork of bitter repressed British colonies. Some perhaps even sold off to other European powers to cover Britain's war expenses. Envision the French Revolution, that other great upheaval that shook the foundations of monarchy, fizzling out before it even truly began its inspirational spark, extinguished by the failure across the Atlantic. The very words "all men are created equal" might have been remembered only as the tragic, foolish ramblings of doomed rebels. A footnote in history books detailing a failed uprising. The global march towards what many consider freedom would have stumbled, perhaps fallen, at one of its earliest and most crucial hurdles. Number 9. Say goodbye to Liberty Bell. Self-rule dreams everywhere. The news of the American rebels' defeat would have spread like wildfire across the globe, carried on ships to distant ports and whispered in colonial capitals. For people living under colonial rule elsewhere, from Dublin to Delhi, from Cape Town to Cartagena, the message from Britain's victory would have been brutally clear. Resistance is futile. The dream of self-governance, of breaking free from imperial masters, would have been dealt a devastating blow. In Ireland, groups inspired by American calls for liberty and representation, who were already pushing for greater autonomy from British rule, would have seen their hopes dashed. London, emboldened by its success in crushing the larger, wealthier, and more populous American colonies, would have tightened its grip on Ireland with even greater ferocity. Any talk of an Irish Parliament with real power, let alone independence, would have been stamped out. The Act of Union, integrating Ireland fully into the United Kingdom, might have come sooner and with even less negotiation, solidifying British control without the nagging example of a successful American separation. Across the seas in India, the British East India Company, and later the British Crown, would have operated with an even freer hand. The Indian princes and local rulers, witnessing the fate of the American colonists who dared to defy the king, would have been far more cautious. The already formidable British military presence in India would have been reinforced, not just with troops, but with an aura of invincibility. The slow, simmering movements for Indian rights and eventual independence would have been stifled in their infancy, or at least delayed by many decades, perhaps even a century. The idea of challenging British authority would seem like a path to certain ruin. British administrators would point to the American failure as proof that colonial peoples were unfit to govern themselves and that imperial rule was both necessary and unshakable. In the vast Spanish and Portuguese empires of Latin America, Creole elites who harbored quiet desires for more local control would have shuddered. Spain, an ally of France, which would not have aided a failed American rebellion in this timeline, would have learned from Britain's example. Colonial administrators would have been instructed to crack down harder on any signs of dissent, to root out dangerous ideas of self-rule imported from Enlightenment thinkers. The flow of these ideas, already restricted, would have been reduced to a trickle, viewed with extreme suspicion by royal authorities. The very notion of widespread, coordinated independence movements like those led by Bolivar and San Martin would have seemed utterly fantastical, their potential leaders perhaps never even daring to dream so boldly. Even in British settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the path to self-government would have been longer and more arduous. The Canadian provinces, some of which had remained loyal during the American uprising, would have been governed with a firmer hand. There would be no successful United States to their south serving as an example of independent nationhood or a potential alternative. The British government, wary of any hint of colonial insubordination after the costly, though ultimately successful, American campaign, would have been reluctant to grant significant powers to colonial assemblies. The Durham Report, which eventually led to responsible government in Canada, might never have been commissioned, or its recommendations dismissed as too risky. The development of these dominions into self-governing nations within the British Commonwealth would have been a much slower, more grudging process if it happened in that form at all. The bell of liberty, having been silenced in Philadelphia, would cast a long, quiet shadow over aspirations for freedom across the entire colonial world. Imperial powers everywhere would sleep a little sounder, their authority seemingly re-cemented for generations to come. Number 8. King George's mic drop. The empire strikes back harder. With the American Rebellion decisively crushed, the British Empire wouldn't just be maintained, it would emerge more formidable, more confident, and more assertive than ever before. King George III and his government would have seen their policies vindicated. The principle that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a core point of contention, would now be an undisputed reality, backed by the harsh lesson taught to the Americans. The loss of America had, in our timeline, served as a chastening experience for Britain, leading to some reforms in colonial administration. Without this loss, there would be no such humility, only triumph. The immediate aftermath would have seen a significant restructuring of British colonial governance, not towards leniency, but towards absolute control. Royal governors would wield more power. Colonial assemblies would be stripped of their influence or dissolved entirely, and British garrisons would be strengthened and made more visible in all major colonial towns, especially in the now subdued American provinces. The cost of the rebellion, plus the ongoing expense of maintaining a larger military footprint to prevent future uprisings, would be extracted from the colonies themselves through even heavier taxation. No taxation without representation would be a dead letter, a failed slogan of defeated traitors. Instead, the message would be obedience, or else. British prestige on the international stage would soar. Its military, particularly the Royal Navy, having successfully projected power across the Atlantic and quashed a significant internal threat, would be seen as virtually invincible. This would embolden Britain in its dealings with other European powers, like France and Spain. France, not having been drawn into a costly war supporting the Americans, might still be a rival, but a Britain flush with the victory and resources of a still intact American colonial base would be in a much stronger negotiating position in any European conflict or colonial dispute. Global trade routes would be even more firmly under British domination. The City of London would cement its place as the undisputed financial capital of the world, bankrolling an ever-expanding empire. There would be little incentive for Britain to engage in the kind of political reforms that occurred in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The fear of revolution, which spurred some of these reforms in our timeline, would be lessened. If the powerful American colonies could be brought to heel, what chance did domestic radicals in Britain itself have? Calls for parliamentary reform, expansion of suffrage, or greater civil liberties within Britain could be more easily dismissed as dangerous and unnecessary. The ruling aristocracy and landed gentry would feel their positions more secure, less inclined to cede power. The narrative of the great experiment in American self-government failing would be used for generations by British imperial ideologues to justify their rule over other peoples. They would argue that colonies were inherently incapable of governing themselves, prone to chaos and disorder if left unchecked, and that benevolent British autocracy was the only way to ensure stability and progress. The empire, far from evolving or slowly dissolving, would seek to consolidate and expand, driven by a renewed sense of imperial destiny and the unshakable belief in its own superiority and the futility of resistance. The sun, it would seem, would truly never set on a British Empire that had learned not from a loss, but from a resounding brutal victory over its own rebellious subjects. The world map would show a lot more red for a lot longer. Number 7. your unalienable rights. LOL, said the kings. The American Declaration of Independence, with its bold assertion of unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, had sent a tremor of excitement through intellectual circles in Europe. But with the revolution crushed, these words would ring hollow, dismissed as the naive pronouncements of failed rebels. The Enlightenment ideals that underpinned the American cause, ideas from thinkers like John Locke about natural rights and the consent of the governed, Montesquieu's separation of powers, Rousseau's social contract, would suffer a severe blow to their credibility. If these lofty principles couldn't even secure victory for the determined Americans, what practical value did they have? Monarchs and ruling elites across Europe, who had nervously watched the American experiment unfold, would breathe a collective sigh of relief. They would see the British victory as a powerful affirmation of the existing order, that monarchy, aristocracy, and established church were the God-given, natural, and most stable forms of government. The notion that ordinary people could or should govern themselves would be actively ridiculed and suppressed as a dangerous fantasy that led only to bloodshed, treason, and ultimately failure. See what happens when you let philosophers meddle in politics would be the cynical refrain in the royal courts of Paris, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Berlin. Censorship of books, pamphlets, and newspapers promoting liberal or republican ideas would intensify across the continent. Thinkers and writers who dared to question absolute monarchy or advocate for popular sovereignty would face persecution, imprisonment, or exile. University professors would be warned against teaching subversive doctrines. Salons and coffee houses, which had been centers of Enlightenment discussion, would fall under greater scrutiny from government spies and informants. The very vocabulary of rights, liberty, and equality would become suspect, tainted by its association with the defeated American cause. Instead of inspiring further movements for reform or revolution, the American failure would serve as a cautionary tale. Reform-minded individuals within European governments would find their arguments weakened. Why risk instability by tinkering with systems that for all their flaws maintained order, when the alternative, as demonstrated in America, was chaos and defeat? The divine right of kings would experience a resurgence not just as a theological doctrine, but as a practical political reality. Monarchs would feel less need to justify their rule or make concessions to their subjects. The development of constitutional monarchies, where the power of the king is limited by a parliament or a written constitution, would be significantly retarded. Efforts to expand voting rights, establish independent judiciaries, or guarantee freedoms of speech and assembly would face much stiffer opposition. The idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed would be largely extinguished as a practical political force for perhaps a century or more. Political discourse would revert to emphasizing duty, obedience, and hierarchy, rather than rights and freedoms. The intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, which had promised a new age of reason and liberty, would recede, leaving the old regimes more entrenched and the voices calling for change much fainter and more fearful. The bright dawn of individual rights, promised by Jefferson's pen, would be clouded over by the grim reality of imperial power and royal prerogative reasserted. Number 6. Founding Fathers. More like founding failures on the gallows. The leaders of the American Revolution, men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, if caught, or if he returned from France to a defeated land, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, would not be celebrated as visionary founders of a new nation. Instead, they would be hunted down, arrested, and branded as traitors to the crown. The British government, eager to make an example and deter any future colonial insurrections, would have shown little mercy. Imagine the scene: stately gentlemen, once respected members of colonial society, now in chains, facing trials for high treason in courts heavily influenced by the victorious British military and loyalist sentiment. The trials themselves would be swift, and their outcomes largely predetermined. The evidence of their rebellion was undeniable. They had signed declarations, raised armies, and waged war against their sovereign. George Washington, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, would almost certainly have faced the harshest penalty. Death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the traditional punishment for traitors, though perhaps commuted to a less gruesome public hanging to avoid further inflaming collation. His estates, like Mount Vernon, would be confiscated. Other key figures would meet similar fates, or if perhaps deemed slightly less culpable or more useful, face long imprisonments in harsh conditions, possibly in fortress prisons in England or remote inhospitable parts of the empire. Benjamin Franklin, the internationally renowned diplomat and scientist, might have been spared execution due to his age and reputation, but he would likely have died in prison, his name forever associated with a failed and treasonous enterprise. Thomas Jefferson, the eloquent author of the Declaration, might have seen his words used against him as proof of his seditious intent, leading him to the gallows or a lifetime behind bars. Their writings, instead of becoming sacred texts of liberty, would be suppressed as dangerous propaganda. Properties and assets of all convicted rebels would be seized by the Crown, further punishing their families and enriching loyal supporters of the king. Their names would be officially disgraced, erased from public records, or only mentioned as warnings. There would be no statues of Washington, no Jefferson Memorial. Children in colonial schools would be taught of their wickedness and folly, not their courage and vision. The very idea of looking up to these men as heroes would be unthinkable, even dangerous. For the thousands of ordinary soldiers who fought in the Continental Army and were captured, fates would vary. Officers might face execution or long prison terms. Enlisted men might be imprisoned, forcibly conscripted into the British Army or Navy to serve in distant, unhealthy colonies, or transported as indentured laborers to other parts of the empire. Promise of land bounties that had motivated many to fight for the Revolution would of course evaporate. Instead, they would return home, if they were lucky enough to be released, to communities under strict military occupation, their cause lost, their sacrifices in vain, and their futures bleak under a vengeful imperial regime. The psychological impact on the American colonial population would be profound. A generation of potential leaders eliminated or discredited, and a deep sense of fear and hopelessness instilled in those who had dared to dream of independence. The message would be seared into the collective memory. The price of rebellion against the Crown was utter ruin. Number 5. America the a divided, oppressed continent. With the Revolution crushed, the 13 colonies would not transform into the United States of America. Instead, they would revert to being a collection of disgruntled, subjugated British provinces, their dreams of self-determination brutally extinguished. The British government, determined to prevent any resurgence of rebellion, would implement a harsh and punitive regime. Colonial charters that had granted certain rights and autonomy would be revoked. Direct rule from London, enforced by an expanded British military presence, would become the norm. Forts and garrisons would dot the landscape, not to protect from external enemies, but to watch over the colonists themselves. Economically, the American colonies would be bled dry. Heavy taxes would be imposed to pay for the war they had started and lost, and to cover the costs of their own ongoing occupation. Trade restrictions, like the Navigation Acts that had been a source of grievance before the war, would be enforced with renewed vigor, ensuring that American resources and markets served only British interests. Any nascent industries that had begun to develop in the colonies would be stifled to prevent competition with British manufacturers. The economic dynamism that characterized early America would be strangled, replaced by a system designed for extraction and control. Westward expansion. A key aspiration for many colonists would be severely curtailed or managed entirely by the British Crown. London might maintain the Proclamation Line of 1763 or create new restrictions to prevent settlers from moving into indigenous territories, partly to avoid costly conflicts with Native American tribes and partly to keep the colonial population concentrated along the coast where it could be more easily controlled. This would frustrate land speculators and ordinary settlers alike, leading to simmering resentment but little opportunity for open defiance. Without a unified American government to negotiate or wage war with native tribes, the pattern of westward settlement would be chaotic, piecemeal, and likely even more brutal when it did occur, or heavily restricted, creating a pressure cooker of land-hungry colonists. It's also plausible that Britain, to recoup war costs or to simplify administration, might have redrawn the colonial map. Some colonies could have been merged, others divided. Perhaps some territories, especially those considered most troublesome or least profitable, might even have been traded to other European powers, like Spain or France, if France wasn't an enemy at that point. In dueling deals, further fragmenting the continent and subjecting different groups of former Americans to different imperial masters. The sense of a shared American identity, which was forged during the Revolution, would dissipate, replaced by regional loyalties and grievances and a common experience of subjugation. There would be no American Constitution, no Bill of Rights. The legal systems would be overhauled to ensure loyalty to the Crown, with judges appointed directly from Britain and trial by jury potentially curtailed for offenses deemed political. Freedom of speech, assembly, and the press would be non-existent. Informants would be common, and any expression of discontent could lead to arrest and harsh punishment. Migration from Europe, which in our timeline brought millions seeking freedom and opportunity, would slow to a trickle. Why move to a land known for its failed rebellion and oppressive rule? North America, instead of becoming a symbol of hope and a new world of possibilities, would represent a dream lost, a continent under a heavy imperial shadow, its people divided, disempowered, and closely watched. The vibrant, often chaotic, but ultimately creative energy of American society would be replaced by a duller, more repressive colonial existence. Number 6. No Bastille Day. French Royals Party on Revolution cancelled. The French Revolution of 1789 was a complex event with deep roots in France's social and economic problems, but the success of the American Revolution played a crucial, multifaceted role in its outbreak. British victory in America would have dramatically altered the conditions in France, quite possibly averting the French Revolution as we know it, or at least delaying and changing its character profoundly. Firstly, and most practically, France bankrupted itself, supporting the American rebels. The enormous sums of money funneled to the Continental Army and Navy, along with France's own direct military involvement, pushed the French royal treasury to the breaking point. Without this massive financial drain, King Louis XVI's government would have been in a significantly healthier fiscal position in the 1780s. The desperate need for new taxes, which led to the calling of the Estates General in 1789, the event that directly precipitated the revolution, would have been much less acute. The king might have been able to muddle through with more modest reforms or by securing loans more easily without the albatross of American war debt. Secondly, the American Revolution provided a powerful ideological inspiration for French reformers and radicals. The spectacle of ordinary people successfully overthrowing a monarchical system, or at least its colonial extension, and establishing a republic based on Enlightenment principles of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty was electrifying. Figures like Lafayette, who fought with the Americans, returned to France as heroes, spreading tales of American idealism and success. If the American Revolution had failed, it would have served not as an inspiration, but as a grim warning. The message would have been that republicanism was a dangerous pipe dream, that attempts to overthrow established authority led only to defeat and retribution. French radicals would have lacked a potent contemporary example of their ideas in action. Without a successful American model, and with a less dire financial crisis, King Louis XVI might have navigated the political challenges of the 1780s more successfully. The Estates General, if called at all, might have resulted in minor concessions, a power-sharing arrangement that fell far short of revolution or even a reassertion of royal authority. The Third Estate might have been less bold in its demands, less confident in its ability to challenge the First and Second Estates, without the triumphant American precedent. The storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, heavily influenced by the American Declaration and state constitutions, and the subsequent radicalization of the Revolution, including the Reign of Terror and the execution of the king, might never have happened. This means no Napoleonic Wars as we know them. Napoleon Bonaparte might have remained an obscure artillery officer. The map of Europe would not have been redrawn by his conquests. The spread of revolutionary ideals, even in their Napoleonic imperial form, across Europe would not have occurred in the same way. The Holy Roman Empire might have survived longer. The forces of nationalism and liberalism, which were given a massive, though often contradictory, boost by the French Revolution and Napoleon, would have developed differently, perhaps much more slowly. France might have eventually undergone reforms, perhaps even a more gradual revolution later on. But the cataclysmic events of 1789 to 1799, which reshaped France and the world, would have been profoundly altered, if not entirely avoided. The echoes of a failed American rebellion would have helped to keep the French monarchy and other European monarchies more securely on their thrones for a longer period. Number 3. Ay, caramba! Latin America's freedom. Fight gets ghosted. The wave of independence movements that swept across Latin America in the early 19th century, freeing much of the continent from Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule, owed a significant debt to the success of the American Revolution. A failed American uprising would have profoundly discouraged and delayed these struggles, leaving millions under European colonial domination for much longer. The United States, after its successful revolution, served as a powerful ideological beacon. Its Declaration of Independence and Constitution were studied and admired by Creole intellectuals and would-be revolutionaries in Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, and beyond. The very existence of a large independent republic in the Americas demonstrated that breaking free from a European mother country was possible. Figures like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martín were deeply influenced by the American example, by its republican ideals, and by the Enlightenment thought that had fueled it. If that example had been one of disastrous failure, of crushed rebellion and executed leaders, the lesson learned would have been one of caution and despair, not inspiration. The risks would have seemed too great, the chances of success too slim. Furthermore, while the early United States was often officially neutral or cautious in its foreign policy, its existence did provide a degree of tacit support and a potential, if sometimes unreliable, source of material aid, or a safe haven for exiled patriots. More importantly, a strong, independent United States later acted as a check on European powers' ambitions in the Western Hemisphere, most famously through the Monroe Doctrine. Without a United States, or with only a collection of repressed British colonies in North America, there would be no such doctrine. European monarchies, particularly Spain and Portugal, would have felt far less constrained in dealing with any colonial unrest. Spain, witnessing Britain's effective suppression of the even larger and more developed North American colonies, would have been emboldened to tighten its own administrative and military control over its vast American empire. Any nascent plots for independence would have been met with even greater force and ruthlessness. Conditions that allowed revolutionary juntas to form when Napoleon invaded Spain, which itself is an event tied to the French Revolution, which might not have happened this way, would have been different. Even if Spain faced internal turmoil in Europe, its grip on the colonies would have been psychologically and militarily stronger due to the absence of a successful American revolutionary precedent. The economic and social grievances that fueled Latin American independence, restrictions on trade, favoritism towards peninsular-born officials, heavy taxation would have persisted. But the belief that these grievances could be successfully addressed through armed rebellion and the establishment of independent republics would have been severely undermined. Independence movements, if they arose at all, would likely have been smaller, more isolated, and more easily crushed by colonial authorities. The liberation of Latin America might have been delayed by many decades, perhaps even into the 20th century, or might have taken a completely different, less republican path. The continent could have remained a patchwork of European colonies for much longer, its resources continuing to flow to Europe, and its people denied self-determination, all partly because the spark of '76 had been snuffed out. The vibrant national cultures and independent nations of Latin America we know today would have had a much harder and perhaps impossible birth. Number 2. Chains clank louder. Slavery's grip tightens across the globe. The failure of the American Revolution would have had complex and likely detrimental consequences for the abolition of slavery, both in North America and potentially worldwide. While Britain did abolish the slave trade in 1807 and slavery throughout its empire in 1833, the continued presence of the vast and economically significant American colonies, particularly the southern ones reliant on enslaved labor within the empire, would have created a powerful pro-slavery lobby that could have delayed or weakened these reforms. In the American colonies themselves, a British victory would have entrenched the power of the loyalist planter class in the South. These individuals, who had often opposed the revolution partly to protect their property in human beings, would have been rewarded for their loyalty. Their influence within the reformed colonial administration would have been substantial. They would have fiercely resisted any attempts by London to interfere with slavery, arguing that it was essential to the colonial economy and their way of life, and that they had proven their loyalty to the crown. The moral arguments against slavery, which were gaining traction in Britain at the time, would have faced a much stronger, more unified, and politically crucial opposition from within the empire's own prized American possessions. Without an independent United States grappling with the contradiction of slavery in a land supposedly dedicated to liberty, the specific trajectory of the American anti-slavery movement and the eventual Civil War would not have occurred. While the Civil War was a horrific conflict, it ultimately led to the abolition of slavery in the U.S. through the 13th Amendment. In a scenario where the colonies remained British, it's conceivable that slavery might have persisted in North America for much longer. Perhaps being phased out gradually as it was in some British Caribbean colonies, but potentially facing the economic power of the American slaveholders. The North American continent would not have become a battleground over slavery in the same way, and thus one of the 19th century's major catalysts for abolition would be missing. Globally, the British abolitionist movement was a powerful force. However, if Britain itself was struggling with the internal politics of managing slavery in its highly valuable American mainland colonies, its moral authority and its diplomatic pressure on other nations like Spain, Portugal, and France to end the slave trade and slavery could have been compromised. Other slaveholding colonial powers might have pointed to the continued existence of slavery in British North America as a reason to delay their own emancipation efforts. King cotton economy of the American South, fueling British textile mills, would have continued to bind British economic interests to slave labor, making it harder for abolitionists to win the day. The development of African American culture and resistance would also have taken a different path. Without the, albeit flawed and limited, promises of the Revolution, and the later struggles for civil rights within the framework of the U.S. Constitution. The fight against slavery and for racial equality in North America would have been framed purely as a colonial subject's plea to an imperial master, potentially lacking the unique religious and republican language that characterized much of the Asicamelia-Sumbricalan language that characterized much of the Asican-American freedom literature. Chains of bondage, both literal and metaphorical, might have clanked louder and for a longer time across North America, and their echoes could have dampened the cries for freedom for enslaved people in other parts of the world as well. The moral impetus for a global end to slavery might have found itself facing a more entrenched and economically powerful British-American slave system. Number 1. Democracy dies before even got started. Basically, the American Revolution was at its heart a radical experiment, the first major attempt to establish a large-scale republic based on principles of popular sovereignty and individual rights in the modern era. Its failure would have been a catastrophic blow to the very idea of democracy and self-government, worldwide potentially setting back the cause of political liberty by generations, if not centuries. It would have been Exhibit A for every monarch, despot, and ruling elite arguing that ordinary people were incapable of governing themselves and that monarchy or oligarchy was the only viable and stable form of rule. Core assertion of the Declaration of Independence that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed would have been tragically undermined. If the American colonists, with their relative wealth, high literacy rates, and strong traditions of local assembly, couldn't make self-government work, who could? The term republicanism would be associated not with liberty and enlightenment, but with anarchy, treason, and ultimate inevitable failure. Democracy itself would likely have remained a dirty word, as it largely was for many elite even during the Revolution, equated with mob rule and chaos. The philosophical underpinnings of the Revolution, drawn from Enlightenment thinkers, would be widely discredited as impractical and dangerous theories. Aspiring reformers and revolutionaries in other parts of the world, who might have looked to America as a dawning light, would have seen only darkness and defeat. The courage to challenge existing autocratic regimes would have withered. Why risk life, liberty, and property for a cause that had proven so disastrously unsuccessful in its most prominent trial? Monarchies across Europe would have felt immensely more secure, their legitimacy reinforced by the American debacle. They would have tightened their grip, suppressed dissent even more fiercely, and resisted any calls for constitutional limits on their power or for greater popular participation in government. The slow, halting progress towards constitutional monarchies and parliamentary democracies seen in 19th century Europe might have stalled or reversed. There would be no American dream as a beacon of hope for immigrants seeking freedom from oppression or economic opportunity in a land governed by its citizens. The United States, in our timeline, became a magnet for millions, its imperfect promise of liberty and self-determination fueling incredible growth and innovation. Without it, these migratory flows would have gone elsewhere, or perhaps nowhere, leaving many to languish under old-world tyrannies. The narrative of a new world offering a fresh start, free from ancient hierarchies, would have died before it truly began. The 19th and 20th centuries, which witnessed a gradual, though often violent and contested spread of democratic ideals and institutions across the globe, would look vastly different. Autocratic empires, Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and a resurgent British Empire, might have persisted much longer, facing fewer ideological challenges. The great intellectual and political debates about the best forms of government would have been skewed heavily in favor of authoritarianism. The very notion that a nation could be founded on ideals rather than on shared ethnicity, ancient tradition, or royal lineage would have been dismissed as folly. The last best hope of Earth, as Lincoln later called the American experiment, would have been extinguished in its cradle, and the global journey towards freedom and self-rule for all peoples would have been a much longer, darker, and more uncertain road. The grand experiment in self-government would be recorded as a noble but tragic failure, a warning rather than an inspiration for all time.